You recently co-wrote a paper that I have here in front of me titled Beneficial Effects of Linoleic Acid on Cardiometabolic Health and Update. And so for listeners, linoleic acid being this omega-6 fat that is found in foods like nuts and seed oils to varying degrees amounts, that has become, I'll say, certainly quite controversial over the years. Why did you and your colleagues feel motivated to write this updated review?
I think it's because, like you said, it's become controversial for really unclear reasons to me. The science behind the omega-6 story is, to me, is pretty solid in favor of benefit, but perhaps it dates back to the 1980s, 1990s when people got into omega-6, omega-3 ratios and the idea that omega-6 were bad, omega-3 were good. And for some reason, it's just caught fire lately because I think perhaps because seed oils, which is kind of the primary vehicle of omega-6 into our diet, have been vilified remarkably for unclear reasons, certainly not scientific reasons. I mean, although those who are anti-seed oils will pick out a paper here, a paper there, but they will ignore the elephant in the room, which I think we'll be talking about. So in any event, why do we do this? I think it was just, when you see the community beginning to buy a lie, you want to say something about it. You feel like you need to say, no, that's not true. That's just not right. So maybe there's a moral imperative to say, come on. I mean, look at the data. The data are saying a completely different story than this narrative that you're getting on the social media. So anyway, that's why.
Yeah, it's interesting because your article came out, I guess it was in middle of 2024 or towards the end of 2024, I think. And just recently in the last few weeks, I'm not sure if you've seen it, but Steak and Shake, do you know that fast food chain in the United States?
Sure.
There's been a whole lot of PR and kind of song and dance around the fact that they've replaced seed oils or will be phasing out seed oils and bringing in beef tallow. And that seems to be something that the media and at least part of the population is celebrating.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the French fries are going to taste good. I'm not going to knock that. Okay. But it's in the long term, adding saturated fat to the diet and removing polyunsaturated fats is going to increase risk for adverse cardiac events. But, we did this with trans fats years ago where we thought, let's add trans fats to the diet because they're better than saturated fats. And it turned out that was a bad idea. After about 10 or 15 years, we figured that out. Well, we already know this is a bad idea to be substituting vegetable oils, seed oils for beef tallow.
Particularly if it creates a health halo effect. So if people are coming across the information online, I mean, you sort of spoke to the fact that in the 1980s or 40 years ago, at least from my understanding, a lot of the conversation was around the omega-6 to 3 ratio, and then it's evolved. So today people still talk about that a little bit, but as we're going to jump into, there's all these other claims around lipid peroxidation and inflammation and oxidation of LDL, and it all sounds very sciencey. And so when you are exposed to that online and you don't have the time or scientific literacy to kind of go through all of this, then when you see a company like Steak and Shake, which, to be honest, they may have just been motivated just because of the general view across the population, and they may not even care about the science because the population seems to be so convinced that seed oils are bad. It's good PR for them. But the challenge is when people think that has turned that food into a healthy food, and it's this hyperpalatable, calorie dense, high sodium, high fat, high refined carbohydrate food at the end of the day.
Right. It's Yeah, I mean, we were all concerned about misinformation, disinformation during COVID. We're still dealing. We're past COVID, but we're dealing with it now in this particular field here, where the science, the evidence, follow the science doesn't make any. It doesn't carry any weight anymore, or either that, or whose science you talking about, right? That's the problem.
We're going to mention linoleic acid a lot in this episode, and I want to make sure that everyone's on the same page from the outset. When we say linoleic acid, what are we talking about?
We're talking about a fatty acid, 18 carbons, 2 double bonds. It's in the omega-6 family. It's the principal omega-6 fatty acid in our diet. It's an essential fatty acid. That is to say, if you do not eat any of it, you will die because you will develop deficiency symptoms, because it is a essential, like a vitamin A, vitamin B, vitamin C. Linoleic acid is essential omega-6 fatty acid. From it are made many other important fatty acids, arachidonic acid and a bunch of other stuff. But linoleic acid constitutes about 5 to 7% of the total calories in our diet, and that's kind of where most scientific organizations think it ought to be, 5 to 10%. But that's what it is. It's found primarily in seed oils, corn oil. Used to be safflower and sunflower, but those oils now have been converted. They've been changed to where they're very low in linoleic acid. So those oils do not have linoleic much at all anymore. They've been not genetically modified, but what's the word? Where they have bred crops to be lower and lower and lower in linoleic acid. So corn oil, cottonseed oil, soybean oil are really the primary sources of omega-6 in our diet.
Why have oils like sunflower oil, has that selective breeding taken place to increase the monounsaturated fats?
Pretty much because of shelf life issues. The linoleic acid if you leave it out in the air, if you leave corn oil or safflower, cottonseed or soy oil, those 3 oils, if you leave them out very long, the omega-6 fatty acids will react with oxygen in the air and will produce kind of off flavors. And it's more stable. If you want to be frying French fries, chicken, whatever, you want to use an oil that's not going to be oxidized as easily. So for those purposes, I think that's what those oils have been genetically or been modified to be less LA. They're called high oleic oils. High oleic. Oleic is 18-1 omega-9. So in any event, that linoleic acid, to your question, it's the essential omega-6 fatty acid.
And so currently, in the typical American diet, about 6 to 7% of calories are coming from this omega-6 linoleic acid, fatty acid, which is roughly about 150, 160 calories, depending on someone's total calorie intake. And that's around 15 to 18 grams of linoleic acid a day, just to give someone an understanding of what that looks like in terms of food. How many tablespoons of seed oil are we talking about here?
So if you take soybean oil, which is about 50% by weight, linoleic acid, if you're eating 15 grams a day of linoleic acid, that's like eating 2 tablespoons, 30 milliliters, 30 grams of soybean oil.
And how much is required to meet the body's essential needs?
That's even controversial at this point. Required to prevent you from having serious deficiency symptoms. Probably 1 or 2% of energy is essential. It covers, as far as we know, the essential needs. But this is one of those fatty acids, kind of like EPA and DHA in a way, where you can meet your needs to live, to reproduce, to grow old and die. You can survive, on a very low linoleic acid diet, but are you is your health optimal? That's the question. And I think what we've seen is higher linoleic acid levels are associated with better long-term health outcomes, even though you're beyond what's essentially what the need is essentially. Same way with EPA and DHA. You can survive with virtually no EPA and DHA in your diet, but you don't live as well and as long.
Whereas if we were to consider the argument of someone who is a kind of critic of seed oils, they're probably, at least to my understanding, they're not arguing that it's essential. They're saying that, sure, we need some, but they would be arguing that we want to consume like less than 5 grams a day, not this current intake in a modern world that's up at 15 to 18 grams. Does that sound like a kind of fair representation of the typical argument?
That's what you'd run into. Nobody would advocate for no linoleic acid, not even the most anti-seed oil person in the world. They might advocate for no seed oils and get your omega-6s from eating almonds and peanuts and nuts. But you're right. No one would say eliminate linoleic acid from the diet. That would be crazy. They just say reduce it way down.
Yeah. What do we understand about historical intakes and how this has changed over time?
It's really gone up since the I think since the 60s, 1960s, 70s is when seed oil intake started to increase a lot. There's some evidence that actually started at the beginning of the 20th century, 1909 or so. And that's fine. I mean, for some reason, this graph of increasing use of soybean oil scares people. I mean, there's no intrinsic reason why that should be scary. If you look at health outcomes, that's what you care about. If higher levels of those fatty acids in the diet have improved our health, well, we should embrace them. That's the question. The question is not how much has it changed since 1900. Question is how much has it impacted health?
I think this is actually a point worth double clicking on, because I think there's a percentage of people out there who believe that they are looking at health outcomes. So they just might not be thinking about this in the right way. So for example, if you look at the total consumption of vegetable oils since the 1960s and you plot that, you do see that there has been, like as you say, an increased consumption. And then often you'll see that superimposed against just unadjusted data looking at trends in obesity incidence and incidence of type 2 diabetes, as opposed to saying what's the risk of obesity or type 2 diabetes when you compare low to high linoleic acid. And so can you just explain to people how we should be thinking about this?
Well, I mean, it's very dangerous to look at the trends of one thing, one dietary thing, and then one disease, and say, this went up, that went up, therefore this caused that. These associations are very, very tough because it doesn't take into account everything else that was changing at the same time that you're not talking about. Although in the cardiovascular world, I think it's fair to say that there has been, if we want to play the same game, higher intakes of seed oils has been associated with, maybe not causal, but associated with a great reduction in cardiovascular disease around the world. So those go in the opposite directions. Can we, of course, there's less smoking. There's more statins on board now. There's all kinds of, I would say more exercise, but there's less exercise. And that's part of the problem, I think, what you're maybe mentioning, obesity and diabetes, which go hand in hand, that maybe there's been an increase in intake of seed oils at the same time that we've seen a reduction in exercise, a lot more screen time like you and I are doing right now, and a reduction in the increase in the amount of a wide variety of foods that are calorically dense and very tasty and very cheap. And you can't blame seed oils for the change in obesity or or diabetes, just because they happen to happen at the same time.
As a scientist who's trying to answer questions with data and reduce uncertainty in your position, how do you think we need to go about using the scientific method and data to better answer this question than just looking at these very high-level associations?
Yeah, I mean, one way of doing it is randomized trials, of course. And there have been several, but many quite old now. Last half of the 20th century, several of these randomized trials of very high vegetable oil diets versus high saturated fat diets were done. 6 or 7 of them were done. On the whole, they show a benefit of moving to a polyunsaturated fat diet. And when I say polyunsaturated fat, I fundamentally mean high linoleic acid, because linoleic acid is the primary polyunsaturated. Polyunsaturated simply means a fatty acid that has 2 or more double bonds in it. Odd phrase for that, but that's the way it's worked out. And so when you say polyunsaturated fatty acids in the diet, you're essentially talking about linoleic acid, because it's far and away the majority polyunsaturated. So these studies that have been done in randomized trials, several of them showed benefit. 2 of them are being controversial, one in Minnesota, one in Sydney, Australia. And there's good reasons for the controversy. Part of the reason that in some of these old studies, when they put people on a high polyunsaturated fat diet, they actually put them on a high margarine diet. And margarines in those days were very rich in trans fats, because we thought in those days that's why the margarine is hard, solid at room temperature, because there were trans fats in those margarines, but they thought those were the polyunsaturated treatment group compared to butter, for example. And in a couple of studies, there was more cardiac events in the people that were on the the polyunsaturated fat, but it really wasn't. It was also trans fat. So you can't disentangle the trans fat. So what they thought was a good diet turned out to be a bad diet. But in the long run, there's the overall experience with randomized trials is there's a reduction in risk for cardiac events in people who are on the vegetable oil diet. So that's one. Randomized trials is scientifically the best way to do it. They're very hard to do. To change people's whole entire diet for years and years and years is very hard to do. It's expensive. So what we fall back on is epidemiology. We fall back on studies that have examined free living people around the world, getting a dietary intake questionnaire, which is pretty good at estimating intake of linoleic acid. Not as good as measuring the blood levels, but pretty good. So they correlate pretty well. So there was a large meta-analysis by Farvid et al. A few years ago in Circulation, the magazine journal, which looked at about 13 studies, 310,000 people, and they followed them for 10, 12 years, something like that, after they measured their dietary intake, and asked the question, are people who are eating more linoleic acid healthier or sicker? And they found out very strongly that people that reported eating more and more and more linoleic acid seed oils were actually living longer, healthier, less heart attacks, less death from heart disease. So it was beneficial. We've done even better studies, I think, because we've looked at blood levels of omega-6 fatty acids. So we don't depend on dietary questionnaires. So scientifically, we just look at the blood level of linoleic acid and ask the question, do people who have the highest levels of linoleic acid do better in the long run than people who have lower levels? And they do. They have less risk for death from heart disease, less risk for death from cancer, and less risk for death from all other causes combined. So it's really hard to I think, argue against that kind of finding and saying, well, that may be true, but linoleic acid's still bad. On what basis would you say that? What is the evidence that you would use to contradict actual body counts, which is the most important outcome you can do?
It seems to go back, and we'll step through this, but a lot of it seems to go back to claims around single mechanisms like lipid peroxidation or LDL oxidation, and people will be exposed to this on social media, and studies will just flick across the screen. It looks and sounds sciencey and robust, but it's a cell culture study, or it's an animal study, and we know that these things don't always translate across to humans, which is why you have to consider human outcome data, which gives you this big picture, like summation of all the ways that this nutrient or food affects physiology and health as a net. But just quickly I want to double click a little bit more on the biomarker studies here, because this is another thing I think is very important for people to understand. So part of the significance of what you just said, where you can, in a population study, you can actually take blood samples and look at linoleic acid concentration. Part of the significance here is that it is an essential fatty acid. So it's fairly reliable that what you're seeing in blood is reflective of diet. It's not that the body is also synthesizing linoleic acid.
That's absolutely true. So it's a reflection of chronic diet intake. It's a better marker than just asking people what they eat. Right.
Within these studies, there's a mix. Some of them seem to measure linoleic acid in like just circulation, red blood cells, some in adipose tissue. Is there a tissue, Bill, that you would say is better than the other or more reflective of chronic dietary intake?
Not really. For these kinds of studies, whether you measure adipose tissue levels of linoleic or red blood cell or plasma levels, they all correlate very well. There's a strong correlation, but the actual number may be different. The percent composition, for example, in adipose tissue versus a cholesterol ester, another blood marker, may be very different. But if you plot one against the other, the higher levels of linoleic acid in adipose tissue match the higher levels in red cells and plasma phospholipids and all these other lipid pools you can look at. So I don't get too exercised about which lipid pool they're looking at. If you look in the lowest to the highest, whatever, you're going to get the same story.
I've seen some people try and push back, and nitpick these studies and say, well, there's not a lot of studies looking at adipose tissue levels, but there are some. And I think I even sent you a recent study. It wasn't cardiovascular mortality. I think it was total mortality, a Danish population. I'll put this in the show notes. It was more than 4,000 adults. They were followed for over 2 decades. And they looked at, as Bill's talking about here, they looked at the adipose tissue levels of linoleic acid. So how much of this omega-6 is in fat cells, reflective of how these people have been eating, what they've been exposed to in their diet, and compared to subjects with low levels of linoleic in the fat tissue, those with high had a 26% lower risk of dying from any cause. Again, just corroborating what you're talking about.
Very, very impressive.
Right.
Yes. Exactly.
And I tried to look really hard here, Bill. I was like, is there a study that looks at tissue levels of linoleic acid in any circulation or in fat that shows anything but a lower risk of cardiovascular disease or neutral? Is there anything that shows that there's an increase in risk of any type of disease or mortality? And I couldn't find it. So it comes back to your question of, if these fats are so toxic, unstable, and inflammatory, why do we just continually see people with high levels of these in their tissues are doing better?
That's a very basic question that many people on the other side of the debate will not engage. They will go back to, well, yeah, but linoleic acid is more oxidizable. It produces oxidation product. Well, fine. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but that is irrelevant when you talk about what you're talking about here, is actual disease outcomes.
that could be a reasonable hypothesis if this evidence didn't exist and you were just saying, hey, these fats have double bonds and they could be prone to oxidizing and breaking down. We should be cautious. But with all of this data here, I mean, science, to me, and I'm sure you will agree, we're trying to falsify things. We're trying to disprove ourselves. And this evidence is giving us much less certainty in that hypothesis that these oils are toxic and inflammatory. But if we do play devil's advocate here, I think actually the one thing that someone could say to us here is that, okay, so people in these studies that have higher levels of linoleic acid in their tissues, they're doing better. They have less risk of dying from cancer and cardiovascular disease. They have lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes. Okay, I hear what you guys are saying, but how do you know that these studies are not affected by healthy user bias, that these people with higher tissue levels of linoleic acid are people that just generally follow the government's advice? And so they're also doing the exercise, they're also smoking less, they're also drinking less alcohol. And so maybe they're doing better despite their linoleic acid intake, not because of it.
Well, that's a good question. And you really, you can't definitively tell in an observational study whether those other factors. What we do when we analyze these kinds of large data sets, what we say statistically control for smoking. We control for exercise. We control for body weight. We control for age and sex, meaning that the relationships that we're observing are independent of those factors. And it's not as perfect as a randomized trial, but a randomized trial is completely impractical. Cannot be done, won't be done. And so we have to depend on the best evidence we've got. And so you're right, a healthy user, well, if somebody's got higher linoleic acid and you say they're a healthy user because that means they're eating more linoleic acid. Is that part of the health? That is part of the health of what they're doing. They're eating foods and that are higher. The question is, does the blood linoleic acid level reflect the dietary intake? And if that's true, then it's been shown the higher linoleic acid, this really brings up a conundrum in a way, because many will say that a higher linoleic acid means that you're eating more seed oils, meaning you're eating more processed foods. So if that's the case, then higher intake of processed foods is associated with longer life, less disease. Well, wait a minute. Whoa. We don't want to go there, right? I mean, that's the logic you would follow if linoleic acid in the blood is a reflection of, is a biomarker of the consumption of lots of fried chicken.
Right, because what you're saying is that people are not necessarily getting their 15 to 18 grams of linoleic acid a day from simply putting sunflower oil on their salad, that the majority of the linoleic acid is coming from other types of foods and meals.
Right. In fact, when we looked at I was just looking today, what are the primary contributors to the linoleic acid intake in the diet? And in surveys done by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, NHANES surveys and things like that, the first component is chicken and chicken mixed dishes. The second thing is grain-based desserts. These are sources of linoleic acid in our diet. The third is salad dressings. Well, that makes sense. I mean, you make salad dressings with oil.
But to be fair, a lot of those salad dressings, to be fair, I think are considered ultra processed because they do have like the added sugars and all of that.
Right. It's just a very slippery, undefined. Yeah. So you're right. We're not, the people that are eating higher levels of linoleic acid are not just taking teaspoons full of corn oil.
When you then think about that, the fact that this is largely reflective of eating processed foods, it makes it very hard to claim the healthy user bias, that these people are just are doing better because they're generally the people that are eating whole foods and exercising.
Right. I that's a great point. That's a great point. And so this is a complicated story. I think the simple story is that linoleic acid in the diet is a good thing. I think that's helpful. Theoretically, you can make a case that maybe the foods that you find them in may not be healthy foods, but if that's the case, then why are people who eating those foods doing better in the long run? It gets very, very complicated, but I think the bottom line has got to be that these fatty acids, which come from seed oils, are good for you. They're healthy. Like a friend of mine says, the omega-6, omega-3 ratio is stupid. It's good divided by good. And that's right. So why make a ratio of these things?
If you're serious about optimizing your health, I've got something for you. 8 Sleep and their revolutionary Pod 4 Ultra. The Pod 4 Ultra is not just a mattress cover, it is an entire sleep system. With advanced temperature control and biometric tracking, the pod has helped me take my sleep and recovery to the next level. And as someone who is always looking to optimize health, better sleep means better everything. Focus, energy, workouts, and even better communication with my partner, Tawny. What makes the Pod 4 Ultra so incredible? Well, it learns your sleep patterns and adjusts the temperature automatically throughout the night, optimizing your body temperature during the 4 stages of sleep. If you're ready to take your sleep and recovery to the next level, head over to 8sleep.com/theproof and use the code THEPROOF to get $350 off your very own Pod 4 Ultra. The best part is that you still get 30 days to try it at home and return it if you don't like it, but I'm confident you'll keep it. Trust me, your body will thank you for this investment in better sleep. Shipping to many countries worldwide. See details at 8sleep.com/theproof. If people are listening and thinking, well, I don't really understand the point of this discussion and debate, I think there's 2 things for us to think about. One is that if people are going to eat processed foods, what's the healthiest source of fat within them? And if we saw this population-wide transition back to saturated fats, in ultra-processed and fast food as is occurring in Steak and Shake, what's the effect of that? And then secondly, if you are someone that's eating a high diet quality, what's the kind of isolated source of fat that you're going to use in cooking? So there's interest kind of for both populations here. You mentioned that there's not going to be more randomized controlled trials, but earlier you mentioned that we have had a kind of series of randomized controlled trials, a lot of them dating back to like the 1960s, and some of these trials were not perfect, like you mentioned, the Sydney Diet Heart Study, Minnesota Coronary Experiment, which people often refer to a lot if they're demonizing seed oils. They had a lot of methodological issues, like the big one, like you mentioned, being confounded by trans fats within the kind of margarine that these subjects were given. And Minnesota, had a huge dropout, like 75% of the subjects dropped out in the first year. But either way, when you pull together the main kind of randomized controlled trials, and particularly the high quality ones, you do see this benefit of swapping saturated fat for polyunsaturated fats. In most trials, there's this reduction, particularly in cardiovascular events. Now, I've seen a little bit of pushback from some people that say, okay, is that a benefit in total mortality? Is that a benefit in longevity? Are people that are swapping butter for vegetable oil, sure, maybe they have less risk of having a heart attack or stroke, but are they just dying of something else and therefore living the same number of years anyway?
Yeah, well, I think you're keenly aware of the new study that just came out in JAMA about a couple of weeks ago, comparing 300,000 people people eating more and more butter versus people are eating more and more seed oils, higher and higher intakes of seed oils versus higher and higher intakes of butter, in 3 big cohorts all pooled together. And the question was total mortality. It wasn't cardiovascular disease. It was total mortality. and they found that people that were emphasizing more butter had a increased risk of mortality, lived longer, lived shorter, died earlier than people who were eating plant oils. And they even did a sub-analysis that took out olive oil from the plant oils and just said the non-olive oils, in other words, seed oils, that's what's left pretty much. And even the seed oil people had a lower risk of death during that window of follow-up time. Then the higher the intake, the lower the risk of death. So that continues to sing the song that if you're going to move back to saturated fats and butter and steak and beef tallow and things like that, you're going to be increasing your risk of cardiovascular and total mortality. Now, some may say, okay, fine. If I live 6 months less and enjoy my steaks, fine. That's your choice. But don't pretend that it's healthier to ditch the plant oils in favor of the animal fats.
Well, I think it's kind of emotionally uneasy to accept that there's a higher risk. Like, it's harder to just put your hand up, like you said, and just say, while it should be easier, it's harder to kind of say, I just like butter and this food, and therefore I'm going to keep eating it despite the risk. What's easier from a mindset point of view, I think, and perhaps the source of a lot of this information, is to try and twist the data in a way where you don't have these kind of conflicting ideas in your head.
Sure. And I think, I personally, true confessions, I love butter. I don't eat margarines at all. I just like butter. But I've also got a very high omega-3 index. So, in my view, people who have a really high omega-3, I haven't got good evidence for that. Maybe it'd be a good study to do. Thanks for sparking the idea.
Do you keep an eye on biomarkers, though, like LDL cholesterol and ApoB, and kind of make sure that they're in the ballpark?
Oh, yeah, they always have been. I don't struggle with those things. That's partly genetic, too. I think if I was, and I don't have a family history of heart disease, so it's not been on my radar, but I think it's in the study like the butter versus the plant oil study in JAMA. That's fine. It doesn't take into account other factors like omega-3 intake. I would bet you that people who had the highest butter intakes, among those people who had the highest omega-3s, there was a lower risk of death. But I don't know. They didn't do that study. They didn't ask that question. So maybe one of these days we can figure out how to ask that question in maybe in the UK Biobank. We can figure that out.
Is that an independent thing? Do you think that the omega-3s are attenuating some of the effect that saturated fats may have on cardiovascular disease, or is there an interaction there?
I would think there'd be an interaction, meaning that people with low omega-3 are more susceptible to the adverse effects of a high saturated fat diet than people with a high omega-3. I love that idea. Thank you.
We should do a study, because my hypothesis, Bill, to push back would be that those with low saturated fat, high omega-3 would do better than those with high saturated fat, high omega-3. So you take all the people with high omega-3, and I guess my point there would be it doesn't have to be one or the other. You could do both. You could opt to lower saturated fat to within the recommendations, within the guidelines, and optimize omega-3. And maybe that's the best of both worlds. I could be wrong. But that would be my hypothesis.
Reasonable. And that's reasonable.
There is a large body of observational data that looks at food, sort of questionnaires, dietary intake. Then there's this large body of observational data looking at tissue levels of linoleic acid. And then there are, while not perfect, body of randomized controlled trials. And when you pull them together into a meta-analysis and look at them, it suggests benefit of reducing saturated fats, increasing polyunsaturated fats, particularly the higher quality trials. And so altogether, you have these different types of studies, which we would say have higher validity and reliability than Petri dish studies and cell cultures type of studies. They're all pointing in the same direction. So it makes it hard just looking at that body of data to really point the finger at seed oils and say they're the culprit. That's why we have these, this high incidence of cardiometabolic diseases and obesity today. So we really could just end this episode here. We could just be like, this is the outcome data, say no more. But I think that it will be helpful to go through some of the mechanisms, some of the ways that linoleic acid affects physiology, risk factors, because people will still be exposed to these other claims online around inflammation, around cholesterol or blood glucose. So perhaps we step through some of this, and maybe we start with inflammation. Why do you think that there is this idea out there that linoleic acid, this omega-6 fat in seed oils, increases inflammation?
Well, the standard, the story is, so linoleic acid, omega-6 fatty acid, can be made into arachidonic acid, which is another polyunsaturated, very important polyunsaturated fatty acid in our tissues. About 1 to 2% of the arachidonic or linoleic is converted to arachidonic acid. So arachidonic is 20 carbons, 4 double bonds for the chemists out there. Linoleic is 18 carbons, 2 double bonds. So you have to add 2 more carbons and 2 more double bonds to make arachidonic acid. And arachidonic acid itself is the precursor for a wide variety of other metabolites, what we call oxygenated metabolites, prostaglandins, leukotrienes, and then some other things from cytochrome P450, et cetera. These are hundreds of molecules are made. They're called oxylipins, and these are some of them are pro-inflammatory. Some of the molecules that are made from arachidonic acid are pro-inflammatory, and we need them for inflammation when we have an inflammatory insult. And therefore they got labeled, the entire class of omega-6 fatty acids got labeled as pro-inflammatory. Without realizing that as time goes on, we've discovered more and more, and that actually some of the metabolites of arachidonic acid are anti-inflammatory. They oppose. The body is an amazing, complex, interactive system where one insult leads to the development of the products that will slow it down. I mean, there's a whole discovery of things called resolvins and protectants, which mostly come from omega-3, but there are some that come called lipoxin A, which comes from arachidonic acid, and it suppresses the inflammatory response. So it's just far too simple-minded to say that the omega-6 fatty acids are pro-inflammatory. In fact, when people have actually looked at randomized trials, asking the question, if I give more linoleic acid to people, will there be an increase in inflammatory markers in blood? The answer is a resounding no. There is no increase in inflammatory markers when they look at meta-analyses have been done of these studies. There's no increase, and it's been published many, many times. But that does not stop, somehow, it does not stop the idea that's out there in the world that these are pro-inflammatory. It seems like no amount of evidence is going to turn this ship around, which is very depressing. But they're not pro-inflammatory. So put that one away. We can talk about the actual data if you want to, but I think that is the big one.
I think it's important for people to understand that those clinical trials you're talking about, they have actually fed people in a controlled environment seed oils themselves. So I have, just to kind of emphasize and underscore what you just said, I have a quote here from another review, separate to the review that you did with your colleagues. Another review has recently come out. I'll put it in the show notes, kind of tackling a similar question. And they say a systematic review and meta-analysis of 30 randomized controlled trials by Su et al. Involved 1,377 participants showed that dietary linoleic acid from seed oils did not affect blood inflammatory markers, C-reactive protein, interleukin-6, and tumor necrosis factor alpha. So this is the highest quality evidence that we have where you're in the most controlled manner, possible that for us to utilize. We expose people to seed oils and measure these known inflammatory markers, and we're not seeing a change. So it almost seems, Bill, like textbooks and blog sites and Google Images need an update, because it's only a quick Google to search omega-6 pathway, and you'll be exposed immediately to this idea that the omega-6 pathway is the pro-inflammatory pathway, and omega-6 pathway is pro-inflammatory, and omega-3 is anti-inflammatory. And that seems very embedded in society.
Yeah, you're right. And people love a bad guy and a good guy, a black hat and a white hat. They think it's, somehow you can't love omega-6 and omega-3. There's something impossible about that. And that's just not true. I've been obviously a big fan of omega-3 for my whole career. And so theoretically, I should be an anti-omega-6 guy because, they oppose each other, but they don't. And I've just learned over the years that the evidence says the omega-6 linoleic acid is good. EPA and DHA are good. You should have both. Both of them are good, and that's okay. But somehow it just doesn't. You're right. All you got to do is look at a pathway and think you understand all of biology, and that's just completely naive. The body has so many systems, and so when you eat something, it's a whole different thing than when just look at a metabolic chart on the wall. There's so many pathways that are available to maybe even detoxify, to block the oxidation of products. I mean, if we were worried about oxidation of fatty acids, we'd be really worried about EPA and DHA because they got way more double bonds than linoleic has. But we know EPA and DHA are beneficial. So how does that work, right? So people are very simple-minded about this thing. They don't think deeply, and they don't, for some reason, are not willing to process the real evidence that's out there.
I think, it comes back to humility, being able to take the position that you just took there, that, there's so much going on at a mechanistic level. We probably don't fully understand. It requires a fair degree of scientific humility.
Well, even the thing you introduced us with, saying there's no reduction in, no change in CRP when you give more omega-6. There's no change in interleukin-6, another inflammatory biomarker we measured. No change in TNF-alpha. Well, that could all be true, but there could be 75 things that we are not measuring that did get worse. Just because you measure X, Y, and Z doesn't mean A, B, C, D, and E, which you haven't measured, haven't changed. It's just we focus on what we measure. Where you shine the light is where you find your keys. That kind of story.
Which is why you have to then come back and look at heart attacks and strokes and
Exactly.
say, hey, we may not even be measuring the right inflammatory markers here, like you said. Perhaps it does increase some, but what do we really care about? Do we really care about its effect on one single mechanism, or do we care about Paul's risk of having a heart attack? What about, speaking of Paul, and that wasn't a deliberate connection, it was just on my mind, but what about this idea that is put forward, and this seems like a very circular kind of reasoning to me, by people like Paul Saladino and Thomas DeLauer, who are quite popular online, who they prefer cooking with butter and ghee and tallow, etc. And one of their positions is that seed oils are heated during production to 400 degrees Fahrenheit or more, and that because of their fragility or instability, thanks to those double bonds, that causes them to oxidize. And then when you consume oxidized oil, it revs up inflammation. With everything that we've been through, that just seems like quite a nonsensical argument.
It's nonsensical. Number one, I'm not sure it's true that that's the way they process corn oil or soybean oil. They heat it to 400 degrees. I'd be really surprised if that's true. But even if they did, if they heated it to 400 degrees in a completely oxygen-free environment, like under nitrogen, the way they take care of fish oils, there wouldn't be any oxidation at all because there wouldn't be any oxygen around to oxidize. So if that were true, the temperature thing was true, then it doesn't necessarily mean it's oxidized. I've just always been struck by this whole oxidized fatty acids are a problem study. I think I saw one recently with seed oils where they actually showed intentionally oxidized seed oils when fed to human beings didn't change any of the inflammatory or oxidized biomarkers in the blood. So the body has ways of dealing with these things and cleaning them up and removing them so they're not a problem. But I know an extreme example happened with fish oil, which is far more oxidizable than soybean oil. And again, the investigators oxidized fish oils terribly, put them in capsules, and then gave these capsules, oxidized fish oil capsules to human subjects for like 8 weeks, and then looked at the biomarkers in the blood of inflammation and oxidation and couldn't find anything. It was irrelevant. And so I think that if that happens with fish oils, that definitely happens probably I'm thinking with seed oils, where there's very much less oxidation than with fish oils. So I'm not convinced by those, but I think getting back to your point, what we need to look at is the big picture. We need to look at who gets what illnesses as a function of their linoleic and omega-6 intake. And if people who eat more and have higher blood levels have healthier lives, less disease, that trumps all these other experiments. You can throw them all in the trash as they're irrelevant at the end of the day.
Yeah, I totally agree. If there's one take-home message from this episode, that's what I hope people walk away with. And again, I'll just reiterate, stepping through some of these mechanisms it is really redundant, but it's still important because of the information that people are exposed to. So hopefully now, the next time someone sees something on social media about these seed oils being oxidized during production, you can come back to what we're talking about here and understand that, at least in the studies that have been done where they've measured known inflammatory markers, we're not seeing an increase in those things. Sure, maybe there's things that we're not measuring we don't know about. But then a step further, and you look at the diseases where we know inflammation plays a role, people that have higher intake of linoleic acid from these seed oils are doing better. So at least that evidence suggests that you shouldn't be scared about these foods at all, despite what you're being exposed to on social media. You mentioned that there's these two pathways, omega-3 pathway, omega-6 pathway. There's another idea out there, Bill, that if you have too much linoleic acid, and this kind of comes back to the ratio, I think, in some regards, if you have too much omega-6 linoleic acid, it could have a negative effect on the omega-3 pathway. It could reduce the conversion of ALA, this short chain omega-3, into EPA and DHA, and maybe indirectly, high omega-6, high linoleic acid intake is a problem because of the effects it has on the omega-3 pathway. What would you say to someone that's come across that?
Yeah, there's a little bit of evidence for that you can suppress the conversion of ALA to EPA at least. There's very little conversion of ALA to DHA, but to EPA, yeah, there's I can understand that argument. And I don't think it's terribly compelling, partly because number one, the world does not revolve around the omega-3 fatty acids. All health is not about omega-3, as much as I love omega-3 fatty acids. Let's say, just to grant the point, let's say your higher linoleic acid is suppressing your conversion. I mean, I'm always an advocate for eating EPA and DHA preformed anyway, so I don't care about the pathway. They can, you can suppress it all you want. But even if you did, if on the other hand, the linoleic acid you're eating, that's maybe slowing down production of EPA, if that linoleic acid itself has 75 different beneficial effects that completely overpower what little change you're getting in the omega-3, well, then at the end of the day, you're better off. So it's easy to say anything that lowers omega-3 is bad, but that's not always the case. You just can't be that simple-minded about things. You got to look at the whole picture, which is, again, back to your point about total mortality, heart disease, diabetes, stroke, et cetera, et cetera.
Is it possible, Bill, that in some of these studies looking at inflammatory markers, that you don't see an increase in inflammation when you expose people to more linoleic acid or seed oils because the baseline diets are already so high in linoleic acid?
Well, I mean, they've also looked at removing linoleic acid from the diet. Go both ways. Take a regular diet and add more. Take a regular diet and subtract it. And when they subtract it, it still doesn't lower inflammatory markers. So both ways it works. I mean, the other point I think is worth making is just because you're eating more linoleic acid doesn't mean you're getting more arachidonic acid. And that's been very clearly shown that whether you triple or quadruple the amount of linoleic acid or you reduce it by half or 80%, when the people go and then look at the change in the plasma arachidonic acid levels, one of the products of linoleic, it's absolutely flat. It doesn't respond at all to the changes in linoleic acid intake. So that's one of the false pillars of this whole argument, that the more linoleic you eat, the more arachidonic you get. That's not true.
And even then, based on what you were saying earlier, that wouldn't necessarily mean a negative health outcome, because that arachidonic acid is a precursor to a number of different compounds, some that could be pro-inflammatory, some that could be inflammatory resolving.
Right, exactly, right. It's just far more complicated than people give the body credit with.
And I know I'm repeating a few things that you say here, but that other review that I sent you yesterday that you sent back to me just reiterates what you just said then. And I want to make sure people have this in the show notes and on screen if you're watching on YouTube. And I'll quote, so it says, human clinical trials have also investigated the effect of adding or removing energy from dietary linoleic acid on tissue arachidonic acid concentration. A systematic review of 36 randomized controlled trials showed that decreasing linoleic acid in the diet by 90% was not correlated with a reduction in tissue arachidonic acid concentration in metabolically healthy humans. In addition, increasing dietary linoleic acid by 6-fold was not correlated with an increase in tissue arachidonic acid concentration. Therefore, the current human research evidence shows that linoleic acid does not affect inflammation.
Well, does not affect arachidonic acid levels. And if arachidonate's the bad player, then it's not, doesn't make any difference. Linoleic is not driving inflammation through arachidonate, for sure. And there are a lot of, it's very interesting. There are molecules in the blood that are anti-inflammatory. I'm like, there's a thing called nitrosylated linoleic acid. So a linoleic acid molecule with an NO2 group, or NO, I'm not sure what's an NO or NO2, but a nitrate group attached to it, that circulates in the blood. And actually, nitric oxide, we all kind of know the story about a nitric oxide. It's a very good vasodilator. And one of the primary ways that nitric oxide is carried in the blood is through attachment to linoleic acid. And so here's a molecule that hardly anybody ever measures, but those who have looked at it say, oh, wow, this thing is really anti-inflammatory, vasodilatory, healthy molecule, and it's carried on linoleic acid. So that kind of story can play out 100 times in things we just haven't discovered yet, where linoleic maybe doing this, and this, and we just don't know it. But at the end of the day, people are living longer.
Right. it's coming back to kind of close the circle on omega-6 to 3 ratio here. So there is a kind of physiological, theoretical explanation for high omega-6 intake, perhaps suppressing some ALA into EPA. But what I'm hearing from you is that really, if someone has optimized EPA and DHA intake, and we've done episodes on this, so they're eating enough fatty fish per week and or supplementing with EPA and DHA, then that idea of suppression of converting short chain omega-3s to long chain becomes redundant in that context. So top of the list would be, rather than kind of focusing time and energy on omega-6 to 3 ratio, would just be optimize omega-3 intake and omega-3 index. Is there any other reason at all to consider the omega-6 to 3 ratio, or is this something that we really should just be thoroughly thrown out?
Well, I think it should be thoroughly thrown out. I've been making that case for 10 years. Variety of reasons. Number one, when you say omega-6 and omega-3, you're not being very specific about which fatty acids you're talking about. Because again, there are several omega-6s, there are several omega-3s, and without a specific designation about EPA, DHA versus ALA, the ratio is meaningless. Because you can have, obviously the same ratio with all the omega-3s being EPA and DHA, or all the omega-3s being ALA, and you get a completely different physiologic outcome. That's one problem. Number two, second problem with it is you can have high levels of omega-3 and high levels of omega-6 and have the same ratio as having really, really low levels of omega-6 and omega-3. So the ratio doesn't help you with that. Thirdly, the ratio implies that the omega-6s are bad. And we've been over that, and we beat that horse to death here. And so that's the problem. So if you want to correct your omega-6 omega-3 ratio, do it by eating more EPA and DHA. That's the message that unfortunately can come from focusing on a ratio is you think that, I can just lower my omega-6 intake and I'll improve my ratio, but you'll also be less healthy. If you improve your ratio by raising your EPA DHA intake, you'll be more healthy. So the ratio is a real distraction from the real focus, which to me is what's your omega-3 level, EPA DHA.
Yeah, it feels like a distraction because it's like that omega-3, omega-6, anti-inflammatory, pro-inflammatory pathway. If you run a quick search online and say omega-6 to 3 ratio nuts and seeds, you'll see these like images and tables and all sorts of information that's talking about like getting an optimal 4-to-1 ratio, and that means that you should eat chia seeds and not almonds and pumpkin seeds, and that just seems like a huge distraction. Firstly, like almonds and pumpkin seeds are likely very healthy, but it just seems like a huge distraction from what you're saying, which is get your EPA and DHA right, and then any of these nuts and seeds seem to fall within a group of foods that are health promoting.
Sure, yeah, I'm all in favor of nuts and seeds. Go for it, but just don't worry about the omega-6, omega-3 stuff. Just get your EPA and DHA, and then eat your nuts and seeds too. That's fine.
It's 2025, and I have made the decision to join Function Health to help monitor and optimize my health. And honestly, after getting set up, I am wondering what took me so long. Function makes it extremely easy to track important biometric information over a lifetime, information that you can use in real time to make important health decisions. Function gives you over 100 lab tests covering your entire body every year: heart, hormones, liver, kidneys, thyroid, metabolic health, heavy metals, autoimmunity, nutrients, and more. 5 times more testing than your typical physical for $499 a year. A lot cheaper than if you were to order all of these tests individually. That's if you can order them. Take ApoB and Lp(a), for example, 2 very important tests for determining your risk of having a heart attack or stroke. Yet, as outlined in multiple episodes on this show by Dr. Thomas Dayspring, they can be incredibly difficult to order with your local doctor. Using Function is very straightforward. You join and then visit one of their 2,000 US lab locations. I went to one here in LA where I live. It's very easy, and boom, your results are tracked over time time in one secure place. No shady upselling, no gimmicks, just your results beautifully presented and science-based insights from doctors to help you optimize your health. Skip the 400,000 person waitlist today at functionhealth.com/Simon Hill and join me on the path to nerd level health optimization. That's functionhealth.com/Simon Hill. Let's move on a little bit here to insulin resistance, insulin sensitivity, and glucose control. So you mentioned earlier, and it was definitely in your review, there is observational evidence, again, biomarker tissue levels of linoleic acid that have looked at risk of type 2 diabetes. And you see people that have higher linoleic acid in tissue have lower risk of type 2 diabetes. But from a mechanistic point of view, what do we understand about how linoleic acid kind of affects blood glucose control?
Wow. Yeah. And truth to tell, I don't know that much about this side of the story. I know that's Dr. Martha Valori at Ohio State is really kind of an expert in this, and I sort of lean on her expertise in those areas. I know that to refer to what you were referring to, we have looked at prospective observational studies, higher linoleic acid level in many cohorts all pooled together. Higher levels associated with lower risk of developing type 2 diabetes over time. So that's, to me, that's where you put your stake in the ground on that one. Okay. Now, why is another question. And that's the kind of thing Martha's been studying. And when she's feeding higher linoleic acid levels to volunteers, she's seeing improvements in insulin resistance. Why that may be, changing in cell membrane, biophysics, I don't know. I don't really pretend to understand how that's all happening. But at the end of the day, there's less disease, and that's the happy story for me.
I might have to get her on the show at some time.
She would be great. She really explains this well. I need to listen to her.
What about cardiovascular disease? I know that's more in your wheelhouse. Is the main mechanism thought to explain why linoleic acid lowers risk of cardiovascular disease related to its effect on cholesterol?
Well, I don't know that it's the main effect. It certainly is clear that higher linoleic acid diets are associated with lower, and in randomized trials, they will lower LDL cholesterol. And so, all the hoopy about LDL being good or bad, whatever, statins aside, lower levels of LDL cholesterol are uniformly believed to be a good thing from a cardiovascular disease point of view. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And linoleic acid diets that are rich in linoleic do lower LDL cholesterol. So that's good. Whether that's the whole story, I think they also are associated with lower blood pressure, which also adds to it. Beyond that, I think I can't really come up. I don't know if they affect platelet function. I don't think they really do have an effect on thrombosis per se, clotting, blood clotting, which is an anti-atherosclerotic effect. Beyond those two, I think you could. That's where I think maybe a discussion with Martha would be helpful, because she's very interested in mitochondrial energetic, the cellular energy machine, and its relationship with linoleic acid, because there's a lot of linoleic in the membrane of the mitochondria. And I think there's some deep biochemistry there that she has explained that I can't reiterate at the moment, which may help. Just general cellular energetics makes you healthier. So again, back to our standard, we know that higher linoleic acid levels are associated with lower incidence of cardiovascular events and cardiovascular death. So why? Many reasons probably, but I can't get beyond those two right now.
I think I know your answer to my next question here, but we have to cover it. There's often claims online around seed oils or linoleic acid causing LDL oxidation, so increasing oxidized LDL and or lipid peroxidation. And again, these things sound very scary, and I can guess what your response is going to be here. But are these claims that you've come across, and what would you like people to kind of understand here?
Yeah, I've seen those too, and I think I need to look at the actual conditions of the experiment. Were they giving, if people are giving seed oils at much higher levels than anybody eats, we like linoleic acid to be somewhere between 5 and 10% of energy. If you're giving somebody 15 or 20% of energy is linoleic acid, and then drawing some conclusion about oxidation or LDL oxidation and things like that, then that's irrelevant. I mean, then you're just playing games. You're not really studying real biology. And I don't know if that's the case. But at the end of the day, I think you're right. My answer is there may be this adverse effect, what it looks like an adverse effect on one thing in the blood that you don't know is being completely compensated for by 5 other things in the blood because you didn't measure them. You don't know about them. You don't know what's happening in the artery wall. Maybe there is a little more oxidation. I'm not saying that there is. In fact, I think there's evidence that that's not true. There are certainly some studies that don't find increased LDL oxidation in vivo. Some do. But even if they do, that doesn't necessarily mean you have more atherosclerosis going on.
It could be that maybe it increases LDL oxidation a little bit, but it has all these other large effects like reducing ApoB or LDL cholesterol, and the net effect is a positive one.
Right, exactly. They may be stimulating 5 other pathways that are protective that at the end of the day completely nullify that fact. So we get so reductionist in all this. We look for one thing in your diet to affect one molecule in your blood, and we draw all these assumptions are drawn from that. And that's just not the way. You're right. Humility, I think, is what we need here. That we just don't know everything about this. But we do know we can count dead bodies. We're very sure about that. And that's an important outcome.
It's challenging because we're coming up against a social media environment that very much favors the more extreme kind of extremist, alarming, sensationalized position, as opposed to a position that is a little bit more objective and
nuanced, I think,
reality based.
Yeah, right, right.
And another a good example of this, and I sent it to you, was I sent you a video Paul Saladino put up that it was speaking about seed oils and lipid peroxidation, and he was talking about seed oils increase the production of these toxic compounds, 4-HNE, MDA, and it sounds very, very sciencey. I looked at the studies. They were all, like you said, these were mostly animal studies, some cell culture studies. And when I was trying to look I tried to look very objectively. There are human trials that have fed people seed oils and looked at some of these byproducts of lipid peroxidation, like 4-HNE and MDA. And I could not find a single study that showed an increase in these. If anything, it was no significant effect. And in some of them, it was a significant reduction. So I'll put that on screen for people to read. One of them where they fed people flaxseed. Granted, it's not really the most linoleic rich oil out there.
No,
it contains
omega-3s. It's more oxidizable than linoleic acid is.
Right. It contained a lot of omega-3s in it. And in that one, they had a significant reduction in this lipid peroxidation byproduct. So the mechanistic data does not always play out in humans.
Right. Oh, exactly. And unfortunately, Paul, when I watched that video, he says he holds up this beaker with like 75 milliliters of vegetable oils. This is how much you're eating every day. And that's just absolute baloney. I mean, that is twice as much as the known reported average intake. But he exaggerates to make a point, but it's not true. He also said Linus Pauling won a Nobel Prize for studying vitamin C. That's baloney. He did not. He won a Nobel Prize for protein structures. I mean, he's just not telling the truth. That's all. I mean, that's an irrelevant one, but I just caught, what are you talking about? Anyway, I don't want to get off too much on that video, but that is an example of what's out there, and people are believing it because it sounds sciencey. But you're doing a good thing here. You may be, swimming upstream, but thank you for giving me the chance to at least share my thoughts on this. I appreciate it.
We're trying. My pleasure. I want to ask you a few questions about kind of looking forward and where you think this area of science is going to evolve and how this story might play out. But before we do that, just very quickly, I don't want to double click on this one too much. I just want to bring it to the listener's attention. Sometimes you'll hear a claim that there's randomized controlled trial evidence showing that feeding vegetable oils increased risk of cancer mortality, and usually people are referring to this LA veteran study, which did find a significant reduction in cardiovascular events in the group that were randomized to consumption of vegetable oils. But there was this kind of sub-analysis done looking at risk of cancer death, and there was this non-significant increase in risk of cancer death in those assigned to the vegetable oil consumption group, and a lot is made out of that. But almost always, those that are kind of referring to that are not providing all of the details. And one of the details that people overlook is that this was a great study from the 1960s, randomized controlled trial, in that to measure adherence, they actually looked at the serum levels of linoleic acid. So you could see who, it was kind of ahead of its time. And one of the neat things is, like, in the experimental group given vegetable oils, they were able to see who were the subjects that adhered to the dietary protocol, high linoleic acid vegetable oil, versus those that didn't. And when they went back and looked at this slight increase in cancer that was non-significant, it was actually driven by the people that did not adhere to the intervention.
I didn't know that.
And so in this paper, and I'll put this on screen for people to read, this is from the primary author of the paper. They said many of the cancer deaths in the experimental group were among those who did not adhere closely to the diet. This reduces the possibility that feeding of polyunsaturated oils was responsible for excess carcinoma mortality observed in the experimental group. And so you'll often see people point to this and say, this is gold standard randomized controlled trial data. Seed oils are increasing your risk of cancer. It's not until you dig into that study a little bit and look at who actually developed cancer, look at the adherence, that you see that logic kind of breaks down a bit. And then back to what Bill was talking about earlier, we have observational data, biomarker data that looks at tissue levels of linoleic acid and cancer mortality, and you see across these populations high levels of linoleic acid is associated with lower risk of cancer mortality. So at this point, I think that's another position that seed oils increased risk of cancer it's a difficult position to take.
Yeah, that's great. I had not realized that they had what you just said. That's really interesting.
So looking forward, Bill, where do you think the missing gaps are? I think you mentioned earlier, you said, I don't think there's going to be any data that changes the mind of these individuals out there. Is there gaps in this research? Is there any type of study or question that you think should be asked that might help give people a little more confidence here?
Well, I think if we take the position of reality, we're not going to see a randomized trial of 10, 20, 30,000 people to 5, 6, 7, 10 years of consuming one low linoleic acid versus high linoleic acid. It ain't going to happen. Nobody's going to fund that. And so we're going to have to just put up with what we have for non-randomized trial studies. And so we're looking at observational data. So we are currently, as part of this coalition group that we've called the Force Group, we've looked at many, pooled the data from many, many different observational studies together. And we're doing one right now on, again, blood levels or tissue levels of omega-6 and total mortality and cancer mortality, cardiovascular. And that study is going to show the same thing as our study in the UK Biobank showed. From the data I've seen so far, it's going to corroborate that completely. So to the extent that anybody's going to believe that biomarker-based, and when we say biomarker-based, I mean blood linoleic acid levels. The higher they are, the better cardiovascular, cancer, other causes of death. That's, I think, the kind of thing we can keep doing. Whether that is going to convince anybody when they've got their metabolic chart to gaze upon and they've got their in vitro or their animal study experiment that they want to, it's almost like a religion. I don't know why where it comes from, where this energy comes from against these oils. I just don't get it.
Right, and it's a valuing of mechanisms over the outcome data, and I think ultimately that I think what you'll publish, if it corroborates the current biomarker research out there, I think it's going to be have a positive impact in some way. But I think these people that have this kind of deep conviction about seed oils are likely just to come back and say healthy user bias again. We should just focus on the biochemistry and the mechanisms.
Yeah. I mean, the worst thing I saw in the video you sent me from Paul was he referred to a study that I was part of, which one of these collaboration meta-analysis of multiple biomarker studies where we found it. And Jason Wu was the first author. And we found that higher levels of linoleic acid were associated with lower risk for developing type 2 diabetes over time. And all he had to say about it was, one of the authors, he said the study was funded by the seed oil industry, which is absolutely not true. It wasn't funded by anybody. One of the authors had consulted for Bunge, one of the seed oil companies, and he highlighted that author and that thing, and he said, therefore, don't believe anything this says. And that is just completely disingenuous. It presumes that people, science are lying to make money. And it's just not true. It's just not. I mean, there's 50 authors on this paper. One of them has this, consulted for this company once. And it doesn't mean he's biased for them. Doesn't mean the entire paper is. But that's as good as they can do to criticize these papers, is to find this kind of thing. It really aggravated me, frankly.
Do you think that the demonization of seed oils and I guess some of the changes that the government are beginning to make will have a damaging effect on public health?
Yes. Yeah. I think if the current, who knows what's going to happen with RFK and here in the United States, Secretary of Health, who's kind of against seed oils. I'd love to get his ear, and I'd love to have him listen to this podcast, but who knows? It would, if they follow through on their plans and do what Steak and Shake is doing, and in 1,000 different places, they start removing vegetable oils from our food supply and going back to animal fats. We're simply going to increase our risk for cardiovascular events, cardiovascular disease. There's no question about it.
If it's not seed oils, if they're not the culprit for a decline in public health, an increase in these chronic diseases, what's wrong with the current U.S. diet? Where should governments focus?
Well, I think calories is a good part of it. Simply the amount of energy people are eating. People are getting fat, not because of seed oils. They're getting fat because they're eating too much food and they are not exercising enough. I mean, it just seems like this is so simple. That's the problem.
So that's that statement, because I agree with the sentiment of your statement. And I think what we're seeing is, within this kind of what I would describe as a pseudoscience wellness space, there is a weaponization of kind of what you just stated there, because I agree. I think it's a calorie problem. There's a sedentary lifestyle problem. And the people within this wellness community, they're telling the population that what you're just saying there is you're blaming the individual. But I know you're not. I know that what you're saying is, at least from our discussions previously, and feel free to clarify your position here, is that we live in an environment that's making it very difficult to be healthy. So the easy, affordable choice, convenient choice is a hyperpalatable, energy dense, it's delicious, right? And we're driven to seek out these kind of foods that give us a reward because, hey, back in the day, we didn't know when the next famine was coming. The problem is we're never going into famine. So we're constantly surrounded by an abundance of these affordable, calorie-dense foods that we can deliver to our door. We don't have to exercise and move to get them. The way we work is much more sedentary. So it's not a position of, hey, all of the individuals out there are to blame.
No. Right, you're right. It's in the water we're swimming in. We can't almost not help it. It's tasty food that's cheap. I mean, that's what RFK is going to have to run up against. How's he going to turn that ship around?
Well, that's a more complex problem to kind of unravel, which is back to why I think people like to demonize something like seed oils. Is it simplifies a very complex, multifaceted problem, and that provides some intellectual ease or comfort.
Satisfaction that you're right. You feel like you're right. I know what you're saying, and I agree. Right.
Practically speaking, if we're thinking about using oils and fats in our home, I know you mentioned that you use butter, which I think makes all of your points today even more credible. But practically speaking, if someone's listening and thinking, okay, what type of vegetable oil should I be using at home? Is there a winner when it comes to these most common ones? I know like they have slightly different fat profiles and antioxidant profiles, or are they all relatively similar?
I guess I don't have a problem with using what's called vegetable oil, which is soybean oil, on salads and in baking and cooking. It doesn't have you can fry in it where you really can't fry in olive oil. That's got the omega-6. It'll provide the omega-6s. Olive oil tastes great. It's good on salads. And I'm not against olive oil by any means. I'm against the demonization of, I guess it would be corn, soy, and cottonseed are really the primary omega-6 providing oils these days. And I think people should continue to use them. They're cheaper. So one reason to use them is they're just less expensive. And they're not to be avoided.
Earlier, you mentioned that some of these vegetable oils over the years have been converted to a more high oleic acid, so higher monounsaturated fat content, so they contain much less linoleic acid. That's usually sunflower and safflower oil, I think. Where do those, in this decision-making process, if someone's at the shelf, is there an advantage to choosing high oleic acid sunflower or safflower oil over soybean oil?
No, I would think it'd be a disadvantage. I mean, you would use them the same way, but you would be missing out on an important nutrient called linoleic acid.
And what about if someone currently is mostly using olive oil or avocado oil or canola oil that are just naturally richer in monounsaturated fats? Is that the same thing where you think there would be benefit to consuming vegetable oils?
I think that the data we've been talking about compels you to say trying to get more linoleic acid in your diet is a good thing. Trying to be up in that highest quintile or quartile of blood linoleic acid levels is a good thing. I've thought for a long time that OmegaQuant at our laboratory, we ought to create a blood. We have an omega-3 index test, right? Where you measure your omega-3 levels with a dried blood spot. I'd love to have a linoleic acid test and say, you ought to be up here. You set your target high, but everybody keeps telling me, wait a minute, don't do that.
Well, I think you might sell a lot of those for a different reason, Bill. I think there'll be
Maybe.
a lot of people will adopt that test similar to the CGMs and perhaps think the lower the better. They'll be trying to flatline it.
That could be. Well, they'll have to be ignoring our report that goes along with it then. Then they'll be wanting to be in the red, right?
How do you feel about linoleic acid coming from nuts and seeds versus the oils of nuts and seeds? Does that matter?
I mean, I think that's that's probably the one of the best ways to get it. I don't have a problem with that at all. I think that's a great way to get linoleic acid from nuts, seeds, walnuts, things like that. You just don't get that much. You're really not going to get a good load of it like you would get but again, I think we go back to, like we were saying earlier, where are people in America anyway getting their linoleic acid? From fried chicken. They're getting from pastries, bakery goods, things like that's where it is. And nuts and seeds are like fourth, fifth, sixth down the road. That I think that should come up. I'd like to see them eat less of the products that have, that are high sugar, high fat, that also contain linoleic acid, but they don't need to have all. The linoleic's good. The other stuff is bad. Unfortunately, they come together in some cases. So I'd like to see more natural consumption, but I don't want to reduce the consumption.
We've spoken a little bit about heating these oils earlier when we were talking about the production of them. I still think there'll be some people listening thinking, okay, Bill's shared the randomized controlled trial data, the population studies looking at biomarkers, linoleic acid, tissue levels. How do we know how these people were using these vegetable oils in their life? Are they actually safe to cook with?
Yeah, and I don't know how they're using them in their lives. Again, the studies, we looked at blood omega-3, omega-6 levels. Other people have looked at dietary omega-6 levels, so they would have a better idea of exactly what foods people were eating. And so I don't know. I assume that when you do these food frequency questionnaires, you're saying how often you eat certain kinds of foods, and we know the linoleic acid content of those foods. I'm not convinced that the heating argument there's any substance behind it other than just fear. I don't know that there's any real damage being done to the oil other than just people screaming that it's a high temperature, therefore it must be bad. It doesn't have to be bad. I mean, just because it's hot. I don't know how hot it gets. I would be surprised if it's 400 degrees.
This was also something that other review from Lee et al. That I'll put into the show notes, they relatively comprehensively covered high temperature cooking and the evidence that's looked at that, and their kind of final take-home point from human randomized controlled trial data was that the human research evidence suggests that seed oils are relatively safe for cooking.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I mean, that makes sense to me.
Is there anything, Bill, that we have skipped over or that we spoke about that you wanted to kind of add on to before we close this out?
Boy, it's been very comprehensive. You got a lot of great questions. Nothing really. I mean, I can't think of anything else that's more compelling than what we've already talked about.
Well, thanks again, Bill. I think that this information, like the other episodes we've done, will be tremendously helpful for the listeners. I think it's going to help people hopefully be a little bit more critical about the claims that they see online about seed oils and omega-6 fats, and also help reduce some anxiety that they may have around their own food choices. So it goes without saying, I really appreciate you as a trusted resource that we can rely on, and appreciate you taking the time to be with us today.
Well, I enjoyed it. I always like talking to you, Simon. It's great.
Thank you, Bill. There you have it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did and want to stay up to date with future episodes, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow on Apple or Spotify. Finally, thank you for showing up and the effort that you're making to take control of your health. I look forward to hanging out with you again in the next episode.